It always amazes me how people who hate God, who are against Jesus, always talk about how there's no historical evidence for Jesus. This is one of their main bases for saying that it's a fairy tale, that people who follow Jesus may as well be following the tooth fairy or Zeus or whatever crazy other thing they come up with. Now, a lot of this is not their fault. They're often just repeating what they've heard somebody else say. Even TV shows, very famous TV shows, that will twist truth into fitting, for lack of a better word, their narrative. We see this in the news all the time, right? Well, it's no different in archaeology or history or science. Humans are humans, and humans are going to try to twist things to fit whatever they can, however they can make it fit. For instance, there are some very famous programs on channels that focus on history and science that outright declare that there is no archaeological evidence for Jesus, which to say that there's no evidence in archaeology that Jesus ever existed is a complete fabrication. It's a total lie, and it's a total twisting, because they wouldn't say there's no archaeological evidence for something that they believe in, but because they don't believe in Jesus and they don't want people to believe in Jesus, they will even go so far as to say something that's a half-truth, right? Yes, we don't have a painting of Jesus in his day. Sure, there are certain things like that, but there's more historical evidence for Jesus than many other people that people follow and listen to and see as historically accurate. So today we're going to look at 10 historic, primarily non-Christian authors who wrote about Jesus within decades of his death. This is really key because this is actual proof. You feel free to look any of this up yourself. This is actual historic evidence of Jesus. And yes, it could very well be considered archaeological evidence because this evidence was found through archaeology. These are ancient documents that were found. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. The very first person that we're going to refer to is a man named Tacitus. Now, he wrote two major works, and he was a Roman historian, and his works were simply called histories. And this covers the Roman empires from AD 69 to 96. He also wrote one called the Annals, which covers from 14 AD to 68 AD. And in Annals, he talks about Nero. Now, Emperor Nero very famously ruled during the time of the apostles. He brutally persecuted them. Nero was the one who beheaded Paul and who crucified Peter upside down. He was very, very much against the Christians. And this is what, and so I should just throw out, we're not even going to talk about Nero, but the fact that he so strongly persecuted the Christians should be evidence enough, but we won't go into that right now. So this is what Tacitus says about Nero, referring to Nero's treatment of the Christians. Again, we could go from Nero's side, but we're not going to do that. So it says, consequently, to get rid of the report. Now, to give you some background, Nero burned down the districts of Rome, and the people were really mad at him about it. This is a whole different thing. Maybe I'll do an episode on this. He burned down Rome, very famously, playing on his harp, singing like a crazy person, while Rome burned. Afterwards, the people were really mad at him. He realized that he needed to blame somebody, so he blamed the Christians. He created the Colosseums, trying to get his reputation back, throws the Christians into the Colosseums to fight animals. It's a way for him to punish the Christians and blame them for what he did, and also at the same time try and get favor back with his people. So this is what Tacitus says about him. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report being that he was the one who burned down Rome, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So it's mentioning Pilate, mentioning Jesus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out. So not only in Judea, they're the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So you get this. This is a non-Christian, right? This is from most of these are going to be from non-Christian perspectives, so they're not seeing Christianity in a positive light. He's essentially saying they tried to persecute the Christians, and instead of being successful in persecuting them, revival broke out. That's what that really means. Historically, that's what we see over and over again. Let's see. Where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, talking about Jerusalem. So this is number one. Tacitus, this is so strong. This is rock solid evidence about Jesus. This is from a non-Christian source, so there's no bias there. He directly refers to Jesus as Christ. He directly refers to Pontius Pilate, and he refers to him receiving the death penalty and the spread of Christianity. Let's go on to number two. Number two is a writer named Suetonius. Now, Suetonius, I don't know if I'm saying that right or not, it could be Suetonius. He lived around the year 120 AD. His most famous work, he wrote this book called The Lives of the Caesars. In this book, he writes about the 12 Caesars, all the way from Julius Caesar to Domitian. Domitian was a horrible persecutor of the Christians as well. Again, we won't go into him. I love church history and all that, which is why I keep referring to these things, because I've read about all these guys. But he has a chapter where he talks about Emperor Claudius. And he talks about Claudius's reason for expelling the Jews from Rome. Now, this is also described in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, which says, "There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them." That's what Acts chapter 18, verse 2 says. Now, let's come here and let's look at what Suetonius says. He says that the reason why Claudius expelled the Jews was since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Christ. He expelled them from Rome. So there we have, once again, another rock-solid evidence, writings of Jesus outside of the Bible. Let's look at number three. Number three is probably the most famous, and that is Josephus. Josephus, he refers to Jesus very famously in his work, The Antiquities of the Jews. And here, in Antiquities of the Jews, he says this: "At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus," direct reference to Jesus. "His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion." So this is a secular historian writing about Jesus, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Number 4 is Marabar Serapion. Now, Marabar Serapion, he lived around the year 73 AD. Now, Jesus died around 30 AD, so this is only a few decades later. This is around the time when a lot of the apostles would have recently died. I believe Timothy died around, I know he wasn't one of the apostles, but I believe Timothy died around 70, it was between 70 and 90 AD as well. And Marabar Serapion, he was in prison, and he wrote a letter to his son, who was also called Serapion, and in it he's telling his son to pursue wisdom, to become wise. And during this letter, he refers to Jesus. And he says, "What else can we say? When the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because their country was completely covered in sand in just 1 hour? Or the Jews by killing their wise king, because their kingdom was taken away at that very time?" This is referring to the Roman occupation. And in the 70s AD, Jerusalem was completely leveled, just like Jesus had prophesied. God justly repaid the wisdom of these 3 men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samians were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno. Nor is the wise king because of the new laws he laid down. Let's go on to number 5. This one comes from Pliny the Younger in around the year 112 AD. This is when Christianity was exploding. There was revival happening, and he was having issues with the Christians. This is a man who did not like Jesus, or Christianity, and he's writing Emperor Trajan or Trajan. Now, Emperor Trajan very famously took the Christian leaders at that time, and because they're trying to stamp out Christianity, he tied an anchor around their necks and would throw them into the ocean to try to kill them and try to scare off others. Pliny is writing to Emperor Trajan, and he says this: "Others, whose names were given me by an informer, first said that they were Christians, and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been, but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities, and cursed the name of Christ. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this: that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it." Number 6. Around 166 AD, a man named Lucian of Samosata, if that's how you say it, he did not like the Christians, and he wrote here in what's called the Death of the Peregrine, mocking Christians. However, regardless of his reason behind writing it, he actually is helping the cause now, because God has turned it around, right? Because he is giving us more historic evidence of the life of Jesus. So here we go. "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account." So he was crucified for what he taught. "You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, eternal life, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgivers that they are all brothers from the moment that they're converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws." I mean, come on, this is like really solid stuff, proving that Jesus in fact lived, he was crucified, he was God, he rose again. I mean, if this isn't evidence, I mean, there's more evidence for Jesus than there was for so many other famous people. All right, let's continue. I don't want to get on a rabbit trail here. Let's go on to number 7. Number 7 is a man named Thallus. Thallus is the earliest known non-biblical, non-Christian writer about Jesus. This was written roughly 55 AD. And as a matter of fact, this is so old that we only have little fragments of his writings, and these are writings that were passed down orally and then transcribed further later on. This one, for example, was quoted by a man named Julius Africanus around 220 AD. But this was passed down through generations, through decades of his quote. And so I'm going to read to you what he says. "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness." I love this. This is referring to the earthquake that took place when Jesus was crucified. "And the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus in the 3rd book of his history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." That is the earliest known writing referring to Jesus specifically in Judea, specifically at the crucifixion. It's incredibly powerful. This comes from this happened in Matthew chapter 27, verse 45. Now, just to be clear, this is only a fragment of what he had written, and it's largely assumed and believed by many other Christian archaeologists and non-Christians as well, people who are a little bit more open-minded to Jesus and are looking at actual facts instead of twisting things to believe what they wanted to believe, that he probably wrote more about Jesus in his writings. But we don't have that, so we're not gonna go into that, but that's just generally what people believe. All right, let's go on to number 8. Number 8 was written by a man named Celsus around the year 170 AD. This is a written attack on Christianity, and we're going to read it in all its glory. This is in part of a debate that was taking place between Celsus and Origen, who was a well-known Christian writer. So let's read what he says. In imitation of a rhetorician training a pupil, he, Celsus, introduces a Jew who enters into a personal discussion with Jesus and speaks. Now, remember, this was written in 175 AD. So this is not modern day. A personal discussion with Jesus, and speaks in a very childish manner, altogether unworthy of the gray hairs of a philosopher. Let me endeavor, to the best of my ability, to examine his statements, and show that he does not maintain throughout the discussion the consistency due to the character of a Jew, for he represents him disputing with Jesus and confuting him, as he thinks on many points, and in the first place, he accuses him of having invented his birth from a virgin, and upbraids him with being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country, who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. That after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers, on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So essentially, it's telling the Christmas story, but in a very negative, non-Christian, this is all fantasy, this is all fairy tale, and saying that Jesus pretended to do miracles because he learned miraculous powers from Egypt, and he came back and he used them, and he called himself a god through all of this. So it's a very negative view of Jesus, of which we know that this was coming. We get this all the time, right? But regardless of that, it is more historic writing of him. All right, let's move on to number 9. There was a man around 140 AD by the name of Phlegyon. Now, he wrote several books. He was a historian who wrote books. Unfortunately, his original books no longer exist. However, Origen, who I mentioned earlier, who was another Christian philosopher, writer, historian, mentions the works of Phlegyon in his own works. And he says this. He says, now Phlegyon, in the 13th or 14th book, he wrote a lot of books, I think of his chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, so Phlegyon, he referred to Jesus as a prophet, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. He's basically saying he was not only a prophet, but he was an accurate prophet. And with regard to the eclipse and the time of Tiberius Caesar, which, again, this is the crucifixion when everything went dark, in whose reign Jesus appeared to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegyon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his chronicles. We have in the preceding pages made our defense, according to our ability, adducting the testimony of Phlegyon, who relates that these events took place at the time when our Savior suffered. And he goes on to say that Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment, and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. So this is non-Christians. Now, Origen was a Christian, but we don't know about Phlegyon, but regardless, this is historic data that shows us that Jesus was alive, he was crucified, raised from the dead, and showed people the marks on his hands and feet. All right, lastly, number 10. There is a medieval Jewish retelling of the life of Jesus that was written around the year 1000 AD. I know this isn't really super close to the time of Jesus, but it's very interesting, and it refers to a lot of things that happened in the time of Jesus. It got a lot of historical accuracy, a lot of data, and we could go into others. There are multiple Christian writers around that time we could talk about that were all written around the time of Jesus. But I thought, this is another very non-Christian writing, a very anti-Christian writing of about Jesus, and it's called the Toledot Yeshu. It was written around 1000 AD. Now, this is a specific attack on the miracles of Jesus. I can't read the whole thing because it's really long. I really recommend that you go look for it yourself. It says, In the year 3671, in Jewish reckoning, it being around 90 BC, in the days of King Janus, or Jannaeus, a great misfortune befell Israel. And there was a certain disreputable man from the tribe of Judah whose name was Joseph Pandora. He lived at Bethlehem in Judah. Near his house dwelt a widow, and her lovely and chaste daughter was named Miriam. Miriam was betrothed to Johanan of the royal house of David, a man learned in the Torah and God-fearing. And it goes on to describe the family line of Jesus and how Mary and Joseph came together. And later it goes on to say, a boy was born whose name was Yeshu, which is interesting. It says this, Yeshu is the Jewish name for Jesus, and it means, may his name be blotted out. This is a very anti-Christian, very anti-Jesus thing. Imagine that. On the 8th day, he was circumcised, and when he was old enough, he was taken to the house and instructed in Jewish tradition. And it goes on. It's very long. It's quite long, so we won't go all of it. But it goes on. For example, here's a place where it says, Yeshu proclaimed, I am the Messiah. And concerning me, Isaiah prophesied and said, Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He quoted other messianic texts, insisting, David, my ancestor, prophesied concerning me. And this is a whole huge writing about Jesus that gives a very detailed, very anti-Christian account of Jesus and his miracles. So this is number 10, right? And here's the thing. These are only 10. There are a lot more of these writings. There's so many writings from the time of Jesus all the way up, proving historically that Jesus existed as a person. So if anyone ever tells you that there's no historic evidence that Jesus existed, tell them that unfortunately they're misinformed, and show them some of these things, because there is quite a bit of historic evidence that Jesus existed. Thank you for joining me. Let me know in the comments what you think. What are some other evidences that you know of? Make sure to like and subscribe and do all those things that you know that you're supposed to do, because it's awesome and it helps me to see that you're here. And I hope to see you in the next episode.